We're going to give it one more minute and then we will kick off. We have a good sized group tonight. Thanks for being with us. Excellent. I think we're ready to go. Thank you, everybody, for being with us this evening. This is for joining us for this very special conversation with author David George Haskell. David, welcome. Thanks for being with us tonight. I want to just take a moment and welcome you all officially tonight. My name is Sean Charette. I'm the director here at the Wendell Gilley Museum in Southwest Harbor, Maine. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Charles Stanhope. Charles is a trustee of the Southwest Harbor Public Library right down the street from the museum. We're about 5 minutes apart down Main Street. We have been, the Gilley Museum and the library have been collaborating now for quite a while on some different fun projects. One of them is this pilot program called Reading with Wings. The program started last month with a fiction writer named Stephen Burrows, author of the Birder Murder Mystery series, which is fantastic. Some fantastic books, and continues tonight. This is our second talk in the series with nonfiction author David George Haskell. It feels a little, what's the term? It feels a little unfair to describe you that way. David is a prolific author, a biologist whose work is all really about finding ways to connect profoundly with nature, with the world around us, using all of our senses. And helping other people to find that, experience nature and the world around us in that way too. His work has been described as a new genre of nature writing, located somewhere between science and poetry. I think we'll get a good sense of that this evening. We're in for a real treat, along with the writing, some listening, and some sounds from nature too, which would be fantastic. We're here tonight to celebrate his latest book, Sounds Wild and Broken. You see a copy of it here behind me. Sounds Wild and Broken, Sonic Marvel, Evolution's Creativity, and the Crisis of Sensory Extinction. Following David's talk tonight, we'll have a Q&A, and we really like to think of these as conversations, so we hope you will join us in that. We are on a webinar, so we can't see you and hear you, unfortunately. Very unfortunate we can't hear you. But if you hover around the bottom edge or one of the sides of your screen, you should see a Q&A button pop up. Just as you're feeling inspired, you don't need to wait for the end. Type in your thought or your question there, and we will make sure we get that to David. And hopefully at the end, we'll have a nice conversation going. There's a lot to talk about tonight. I want to thank you all again for being with us tonight. As you will discover tonight, our guest is really a fascinating person. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Charles, to give us a little background, to tell us a little bit more about David, and then we'll have a chance to hear your words, David. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and I bring you greetings from the library board and staff at the Southwest Harbor Public Library. We're very happy to participate in a demonstration of how the cultural cornerstones of Southwest Harbor are beating firmly and strong. And there are many other things. So I'm just going to take a moment to say there are other things to watch for in our collaborations. There is family time at the Gilley. Friday afternoon, the 31st is the next one. No registration required. Library staff, Miss Chrissy will come and tell stories, and there will be crafts or opportunities for creativity there. And then Steve Below from the Gilley is going to be the month of June's front room artist at the Southwest Harbor Public Library, keeping up that tradition of artists. I would encourage you to come in the month of March and see the women in our community as we celebrate Women's History Month. We're celebrating collaborating women who tell our stories. We're all about stories. And I've only had an opportunity to get in some of this wonderful book, but you will be captivated. And you will find early on in this book, it doesn't take long, Longfellow makes an appearance early on. The lobsters are there. The right whales are there. All of the things we're living with around us. And we're in such a particularly sensitive place to the environment in which we live. And it occurred to me to suggest to all of you with family and friends coming in the warmer season, you need one of each of David's books in your B&B or your rental property, because it's what is all about the world in which we live. Of course, there are copies. I want to make sure you all know there are copies available in the Gilley and at the library for you for this one. And the library has added copies of David's other titles, so you can borrow the other titles. I can't discourage you from going to bookstores, but I have to encourage you to go to the library and other libraries and all libraries in support of what libraries mean in our country. One more thing about how the library and the Gilley are collaborating with with Miss Chrissy in the children's department and a wonderful generous donor. We have made discovery packs for the Gilley, the Seal Cove Auto Museum, and the Abbey for you and your family or visiting cousins and nieces and nephews and grandchildren to borrow the discovery pack when you are going to go to one of those three institutions here on the library, and see where that discovery challenge will take you in those collections as well. It will bring them alive, I know, in ways that you might not be able to create for yourselves. Let's see, I don't want to talk very long. I do want to just emphasize, Sean ran a bit of David's bio, and I don't want to sit here and read all about him. I want to encourage you to go and look at his webpage. He's incredibly generous. He is a teacher extraordinaire. He is teaching in every venue you can imagine, and it's accessible at your fingertips, just like this program is this evening. But I did want to amplify because I was curious to go and find out about this wonderful distinction that accrued to this book that we're going to talk about from the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. That is a recognition of literary excellence on the subject of physical or biological science that communicates complex scientific concepts to a lay audience. And I am the most unscientific person you could imagine, but it's just captivating and it does get you thinking. David's narrative and David's prose, as Sean alluded, is just elegant is the best possible word. It's just wonderful and really gorgeous. I was going to tell you one other thing about Agnes' distinctions. Since we're here on this side of the pond, David's a fellow of the Linnean Society, which is the world's oldest active society devoted to natural history. Now, that doesn't mean David's the world's oldest natural science historian, but that society was founded in 1788. And I was going to prevail and have David indulge me just because I found this quote so scintillating and evaluating this book that was in the New York Times Book Review. You'll know more about what this reference is once you've read the book, but in the 12th century, one of the world's first guidebooks, The Pilgrim's Guide, detailed routes and practical advice for travelers along the Camino de Santiago. And the promise of that expedition was the miracles ahead. Health is given to the sick, vision is given to the blind, hearing is revealed to the deaf. And springboarding from that, David's opened our ears with this book. We have been deaf in so many ways to the sounds around us that we're losing and have lost, but I think our ears are going to be opened by the experience of reading David's wonderful narrative. So I encourage you all to go to his website. There are links and there are sounds that you can listen to over and over and over again. So without further ado, I just want to welcome and get David in front of you with his wonderful presentation. He's been raring to go, and we're delighted to have him among us, and we hope this might be the first of several visits.
Well, thank you, Charles. Thank you, Sean, for your welcome, and thank you to the library and the museum. It's really an honor for me to join you here. Hope one day I can do so in person when the season and the time is and my migratory movements align. So I'm sending my greetings today from Atlanta, Georgia, where it's warm and toasty, and we're fattening up the hermit thrushes and the vireos and the cedar waxwings, and we'll be sending them your way shortly. So I should mention also that, I mean, you mentioned some of the Maine connections in the book. Later on in the book, there's some discussion of the cicadas in Maine and a contrast between the cicadas, which are, very quiet and polite in Maine compared to, say, in Georgia and Tennessee, or indeed the Amazon rainforest. And also I should note that the songs of trees was partly written in Maine thanks to the generosity of the Haywoods, who I believe are on the call on the Zoom right now. So I want to send my greetings and acknowledge some Maine roots for some of the words. The good ones were the ones rooted in Maine, and the other ones I'll take responsibility for. So it's a delight and an honor to join you. My hope this evening is to share a few stories about sound, and to maybe give you a little bit of extra context or reframe some of the ways that you listen to birds and insects and the other natural sounds. And as Charles mentioned, of course, the soundscapes of the island, and more general of the coast and coastal Maine, are extraordinarily diverse. Seasonally, of course, January, very different the soundscape than July and August. But also by subhabitat. And so you live in a very acoustically rich place, and also a place where the sounds of human industry, although and activity, although they are present, and of course people have been part of the land ever since the glaciers retreated. But the industrial sounds are a little more muted, and so some of those sounds of the more than human world are manifest more clearly and vividly. So you're really in an extraordinary place, not just, of course, for listening, but other forms of engagement with what we call the natural world. Although that's not a term I'm particularly fond of, because it makes a divide that, well, I'm in a house now, and in my view, the house is part of the natural world too, because a clever tropical primate, namely Homo sapiens, built it, and we're part of nature too. So the whole nature culture divide is not one that I'm a huge fan of. So let us start by taking a little trip to the Amazon rainforest. I want to share a couple of sound clips, and I'll share the clips, show a couple of slides, and then I'll switch the slides off for a little bit, and then I'll come back later with some slides. So we're going to go back and forward. Slides, I'm a big believer in the face and the voice, not just the PowerPoint. So imagine that the humidity has gone up into the 90s. It's nice and warm and toasty, sauna-like. And I will share my screen here and tell you what we're about to do here. So I'm going to share a couple of different sound samples. And these are sound samples that recorded from the top of a sabo tree. For those of you who've read the Songs of Trees, this is actually the tree that opens that book, and I engage with the Amazon rainforest soundscape in a different way in the second book. So I'm going to play this, and of course, Zoom and laptop speakers and computer speakers are imperfect ways of rendering the great richness of frequencies, but I hope you can hear some of the different layers of sound. Listen to the richness, the different frequencies and rhythms and timbres that are present here. So we'll listen, and then I'll show you a visualization of that sound. So that's the sound of dawn in the Amazon rainforest. This is in the eastern part of Ecuador, so the western Amazon. And this graph shows a small segment of that sound in a way that our eyes can apprehend. So going from left to right, we have time scrolling from left to right. And then at the lower part of the graph, those are the low frequencies, the deep pitched sounds. And at the top of the graph goes all the way up to 18 kilohertz, which is really high. Now, if you've got, if you're a 10-year-old with really great hearing, you can hear that. My hearing cuts off about 8 on a good day. And so, of course, as we age, we lose, most of us lose much of the high frequency hearing, but in general, this covers roughly the range that at least some humans can hear. And each strike of sound across here is a different species, the repetitive birds, the low frequency sounds of the monkeys. These bands across the middle here are the buzzings of insects. And so just even without knowing the names of the species and so on, you can, from your eye, you can see that there are dozens of species all vocalizing at once. Very acoustically rich place. And that's just in a 13-second sample. Now, from the same spot, let's have a little sample of the sounds from the nighttime, because this recording is from the day. So here is, well, I don't have a photograph of night. This is on the way to night, and I'll play the sound. So again, here's a similar kind of visualization of exactly that recording. The low frequency sound, I hope you could hear, that said ooh, ooh, every few seconds, is this little mark at the bottom here. These are crested owls calling to one another. They're great big huge owls with big tufts on the top that make great horned owls look like they need to get with the program and grow some longer ear tufts. So they're there. And then these other layers are almost all insects. So you can see there's one here just above 2 kilohertz, another at 3, at 4, at 5, all the way up. And in fact, if I recorded up into the ultrasound, 30, 40 kilohertz sounds that no human being can hear. There are insects buzzing and trilling and chirping all the way up there. So at night, in fact, it's louder usually than in the day. And you can have dozens, sometimes hundreds of species vocalizing all at once. Now, of course, the Amazon rainforest is the most biodiverse place we know of in the terrestrial realm. And so things get very crowded in the soundscape there. On 1 hectare of forest, you might have 60,000 species of insects. And of course, each species, there may be thousands of individuals of that. And so you've got hundreds of thousands of insects all giving voice. And those insects are mostly eating the trees. So what we're hearing is the sunlight that shone down onto the Amazon rainforest that the trees captured through photosynthesis. And then the insects chewed down on the trees. Some of the insects are predatory and ate other insects. But it's all that sound is sunlight that has been refracted through first plants and then through insects, and then even the owls that are ultimately, even though they're not vegetarian, they're carnivorous, they too are their vocalization, their energy and the material that are used in making that vocalization come from the sun. So when we listen, we're actually listening to sunlight coming through the diversity of life. So extraordinarily crowded ecosystem, lots of diversity happening. And of course, the diversity is striking. But what's also striking as a biologist is the unity within that extraordinary range of sounds. And the unity takes different forms. I'll mention 2 of them that are I think are particularly significant. One is a unity in how animals perceive sound. Sound, of course, is made out of pressure waves flowing through the air or the water or even through solids. A lot of insects actually communicate by sending pressure waves through twigs and leaves, not really out into the air. Of course, as humans, we're most used to listening with our ears, but we also listen with our fingertips and detect the vibratory world coming through the rest of our bodies, not just through our ears. And of course, we each have different sensory abilities. Some of us have hearing range that's very wide, some very narrow. The same thing with the sense of smell, the sense of touch and vision. So huge, I want to acknowledge that huge range of diversity, which helps us all, because as through that diversity, we have many different ways of understanding the world, which is a good thing for human society rather than us all being the same. So humans are perceiving sound in our ways, but then the insects that are hearing, and the birds, and then the fish in the Tiputini River, which runs into the Amazon very close to here. All that hearing across the animal kingdom is happening with the help of one cellular structure, and that is a thing called a cilium, a tiny little hair that pokes out from the inside of cells. And cilia do all sorts of things. They clear the junk out of our lungs. They move eggs through fallopian tubes. They help development. They move things through the kidneys. I mean, the cilia are all over and they do all kinds of things. But there in our inner ear, it's little ciliary hairs that are gathered into bundles that detect the motion of fluid in the inner ear that then transmits into a signal into the brain. So we humans use ciliary hairs, but insects the same way. Some of them hear it on their legs and little eardrums in the legs, some on the abdomen, some the antennae. I think pretty much all insects and many other arthropods like crustacea have organs in their joints, in their leg. I'm holding my own leg joint here. I don't have an exoskeleton, but if I were an insect, I'd have these little organs in all of the joints connected to ciliary hairs that are detecting motion. And so that detection of motion, whether it's in an insect or a fish have got them on their body surface. So any animal that you ask, how does it detect sound? Ultimately, it comes down to the same cellular structure. So underlying all this amazing diversity, extraordinary, beautiful diversity, and we'll get to some of the causes of that diversity in a few minutes here, but underlying it is unity. And that's the great thing I think about biology, is that we have both unity and diversity at the same time. Just as when you go to hear a symphony orchestra play a concert, there are themes and variations. Same thing in biology, right? Themes and variations. Here, the theme is the ciliary hair. The variation is how different animals have deployed the ciliary hair in different sorts of organs to hear different parts of the sound spectrum and use it for their own uses. Now, in vertebrate animals, there's another kind of unity, and that's unity in the method of production. If you look at the developmental biology of vertebrate animals, whether it's fish, birds, turtles, humans, pick any vertebrate you want, the sound generating part of that organism has its origin during development in a bunch of cells that are between the hindbrain and the spinal cord that then migrate out and then cause give the rest of the body the ability to speak. So as I'm speaking, I'm using some of those cells that have moved into the rest of my body and developed into complex neural connections and so on to make human speech. If I were a toadfish or a silver perch, those same cells would be producing that vocalization, but not from lungs, but by vibrating a swim bladder inside the fish, or a bird. Birds don't make vocalizations with their larynx mostly the way we do. They have another organ buried deep down in the chest, the syrinx, but again, those same cells are involved in controlling it. What's amazing though is that same part of the developing embryo is also involved in developing the coordination system for the forelimbs. So there is a developmental unity that unites all the vertebrate animals in how we make sound, and within each organism, within each species, that unites motions of the forelimbs with sound production. So when I'm waving my hands around as I speak, actually, it's not just sort of an affectation or, so it's right down to the embryology of human development. Is that why we do that? Or a violinist or a pianist using their forelimbs to make music. Well, sound production is coming from those same cells. So right back at the origin of vertebrate evolution, sound and motion were connected. So dance and music, in other words, have deep, deep roots that connect them one to another, as does walking. Of course, is no surprise that most music has a sort of 1-2 beat. Of course, there are other forms of beat as well that disrupt that. But coming back to that left, right is the most foundational kind of beat we can have, which isn't just a curious coincidence. It actually has its roots deep down in biology. Okay, so there's a lot of amazing unity. I think that has some ethical implications. Another reminder to us that we belong within the community of life, within the bonds of kinship. Of course, each species has found its own way through those bonds of kinship and are special in our own unique ways. But underlying it are these deep ways in which even creatures that seem completely different from one another, like a cicada in a tree and a human walking through the forest, are hearing using the same cellular structures. And that's inspiring to me. And I think it also makes ethical demands on us, because I think we're called to be good members of the family, is one way of putting that. Okay, so lots of diversity, but there's also, lots of unity, but there's also a great deal of diversity. One of the reasons I wrote this book was to celebrate the range of sounds that we hear in the world and to draw people's attention to them and to think about where that diversity came from. Because it's not self-evident, or at least not self-evident to me, why every bird should have a different song. Right? I mean, if the point of a bird song or a frog call or an insect call is just to draw attention to yourself, say, hey, I'm here, would you like to mate with me or stay out of my territory? Just a single kind of loud call, maybe differing in frequency a little bit between species to avoid confusion, would be enough. But instead, we have all these incredible elaborations and other forms of diversity out in the world. So the middle part of the book is puzzling over why sounds are so different. And I'm not going to talk about all of those different reasons today. We don't want to stay up till midnight, but I'll mention just a few of those. How did sound come to be so diverse? Another question is, where do humans fit within that diversity, particularly the human voice, but also human music? And what do we do about some of the sonic crises that we are bringing about now through our noise and inattention and other things? Okay, so the first thing about the diversity of life on Earth is, and this shocked me when I started digging into this literature, is that the musicality, the noisiness of our world is a relatively recent occurrence. For 9/10 of life's history, there's no evidence whatsoever that there were any communicative sounds. The first bacteria in the world didn't make, they make, to this day, they make sounds, but not communicative sounds. And same with single-celled organisms like yeast and amoeba. There are no documented examples of them communicating to one another using sound, even though they do make little vibrations and they're sensitive to those vibrations. So they live in a sonic world, but it's not one in which so far we have found any examples. Now, I should say that there are only about 10 papers in the whole history of science that I know of that have even asked the question, can bacteria communicate with sound? So that's a pretty small sample size. There's a lot yet to be done. And you need pretty fancy equipment to be able to ask that question. So bacteria, single-cell creatures, no communicative sound, but also for the first few 100 million years of animal evolution, there's no evidence that the trilobites, the early worms, the early vertebrates were communicating to one another by sound. How do we know that? It's because the fossil record has no evidence of any sound-making structure, any little files or raspers or popping devices or percussive devices, things that later on in the fossil record we see a lot of. And the animals back then were plenty complex, trilobites in the Cambrian and through the Devonian. There was lots of animal complexity, amazingly complex eyes and chemical sensors and nervous systems and guts and reproductive organs, but no sound-making devices until about 300 million years ago, as far as we can tell. Why did it take so long for communicative sound to evolve? Well, quite possibly because it was very dangerous. To this day, sound-making creatures tend to be the ones with wings or that are well defended and get away fast. So worms do not sing, whereas snapping shrimp and many crabs do, because snapping shrimp can get away and crabs can defend themselves and so on, whereas worms can't. Think about frogs and salamanders, two different groups of amphibians. Frogs, of course, very famous for being vocal. And one of the great delights, I would say, of Eastern North America, I mean, having grown up in Western Europe, where frogs just say, ribbit, ribbit. I mean, and that's a very excited frog. To coming to a place where it is quite literally ear splitting to walk into a swamp where the spring peepers and other things are really going. I mean, it's one of the great delights of being in Eastern North America. So I hope you will take your sound bath in the vernal pools or other places where you can find frogs when they really get going. And I imagine they are already going in Maine, particularly the wood frogs should already be started. I might be wrong about that. But, okay, so the frogs are very vocal, but salamanders are not. They're silent. Why? Frogs can jump away from predators very easily. Salamanders, yeah, they can scrabble away, and a few of them, like the red F's, have got some poison in their skin, but otherwise they're pretty vulnerable. So to this day, it's flying insects and birds and fierce, fast fish that make sound, and all other creatures are silent because predation is keeping a lid on vocal communication, as it may have done for hundreds of millions of years on this planet. Now, the first fossil evidence of, I'm going to share some slides again here, of communicative devices among living beings. My PowerPoint is misbehaving. Here we go. So this is some work from Olivier Betou and his colleagues from the Natural History Museum in Paris. They found a fossilized wing of a cricket-like insect. It's not a true sort of modern cricket, but it's like a cricket if we were to recreate it now. And what they saw, and this is a drawing of the fossilized wing here, is in the right-hand part, there's a place where the ridges, the veins of the wing come together to make a raised ridge with lots of little bumps along it. And they interpret this as a device, a stridulatory device, so a device that would be rubbed against another wing or maybe the back of the insect to make a kind of rasping sound. And this is analogous to the way that crickets and katydids make their sounds to this day. If you look at their wings, you'll see there's a little ridge, a much more complex ridge than the one here, but that's how they make their sounds. So what I did with this creature, which is called Permostridulus, fossil is dated to about 275 million years ago. Notice sound making evolved after the evolution of wings. Insect wings evolved about 300 million years ago. So insects' wings evolved. Insects can therefore get away from predators. It makes it a little safer to make that sound. And a wing is an amazing loudspeaker because a wing is a papery surface attached to a vibratory muscle. So you've got a pre-made loudspeaker. I mean, that's what's in a loudspeaker in your hi-fi system at home. If you have one, is a little papery cone attached to some vibratory electronics. Here, it's not electronics, it's insect muscles. So here's a close-up of that stridulatory apparatus from 275 million years ago. The sound that I'll play is a sound that I recreated. It's a speculative reconstruction of what this might have sounded like. I emphasize speculative because we don't know how fast this insect rubbed its wings, how it did any of that. But what I did was compare the dimensions of this structure to those of modern day crickets and katydids, and then used Audacity, which is a sound analysis program, to recreate this sound. And here you'll hear a little chorus of Permostridulus singing together. So it's pretty low frequency and rough. It's low frequency because this is a fairly big stridulatory file with widely spaced nubs on it. And it sounds rough because the spacing between those is actually quite uneven when you measure it. When you zoom in here and really measure, they're not very evenly spaced, unlike, say, the ridges on a modern cricket, which are incredibly evenly spaced, which is why they can sing with such pure tones. So this is the Earth's first communicative voice, as far as we know. The function of this sound, we don't know. Maybe it was for attracting mates. It could have been a startle response. I mean, if you pick up a lot of insects today, they make a little buzzing sound that causes humans to drop them, but it also causes mice and spiders to kind of let go because it's surprising. So this may have nothing to do with reproduction. It may be about sort of a defensive kind of sound that the creatures are making. So this insect was then joined by many others through the Triassic and the Jurassic, and a great flourishing of insect sound for a couple of 100 million years, in fact, that coincided with the evolution of mammals and birds. And the first mammals and birds had pretty bad hearing in air because they just essentially, I mean, the ancestors had crawled out of the swamp with fish-like hearing. And the way the early vertebrates listened was by resting their jaw or their forelimbs on the ground and listening for low-frequency rumbles coming through the ground. They couldn't hear high-frequency sounds in air. Now, though, we have a world full of chirping insects. That creates an incentive for evolution to invent ways of increasing the frequency range of hearing in air. So that the mammals and the birds and some reptiles could hear their prey. So it may be that our high frequency hearing, if you go way back hundreds of millions of years, actually owes its origin to the evolution of insects. So there's a sort of historical contingency that happens in the evolution of sound. One group of sound makers evolves, and then that opens opportunities for the next ones. Other historical contingencies, I mean, I'll just mention one, and that is the evolution of flowering plants. We don't think of flowering plants as particularly relevant to sound, but if you look at the evolutionary trees of sound-making creatures in the modern world, birds, cicadas, crickets, some moths, they sing in the ultrasound, so we don't hear them, but they make a lot of sound. Some of the bees and others, they all explode in concert with the evolution of the angiosperms, in other words, the flowering plants. Flowering plants are champion networkers and cooperators. They opened opportunities and caused increases in animal community productivity and diversity that were unparalleled. And zoologists call it the terrestrial revolution that happened, starting off by the evolution of flowering plants. So you may hear more from me in future years, because I'm pretty fascinated by that story that I think needs to be more widely told. We often think about the history of the earth as, you know, the animals are running the show, whereas in fact, the plants really, and particularly the flowering plants, are really, really important. Okay, so a few stories about origins and historical contingency. When you hear me speak, partly what you're hearing is the legacy of those high frequency sounds of the insects that increased the hearing range of mammals, that then created opportunities for mammals to communicate at high frequency, as I'm doing right now. I'm not just sending low frequency subwoofer rumbles to you. I'm speaking across quite a wide range of frequencies. Okay, so then diversification, of course, thousands of different vocalizing species, I want to address a couple of reasons why species diverge so much in their sounds. Because as I said, it's not at all, why don't all species just make the same vocalization to attract mates or defend their territories? And one of the reasons is that species live in different habitats. And those habitats have different sound transmission properties. And here I'm going to illustrate this with one example, but this is actually a general phenomenon that applies to whales living near shore or out in the deep ocean. It applies to insects that are singing in different types of vegetation. It applies to fish that are living in rushing mountain streams versus their cousins that are in still backwaters. The physical properties of the environment find their way into the nature of the song itself. So here is our example. On the left, we have the summer tanager, which tends to nest in and sing in deciduous forests. On the right, a larkspurrow from Colorado, I should say that the bird on the left is recorded in Tennessee, the one on the right in Colorado. So a larkspurrow on the right that is in open country, so shortgrass prairie. So the one on the right, almost no vegetation interrupting the sound. On the left, the tanager, when it sings, every single one of those sound waves hits twigs and leaves and tree trunks, and every one of those bits of plant acts as a sound reflector. So the sound gets reflected and smeared and degraded and absorbed as it moves through that environment. And any complex or rapid sound would get garbled and smeared into incomprehensibility. So birds that nest in and sing in forests tend to have slow whistled songs. Birds that breed on open prairies can get away with much more rapid virtuosic songs. So listen to these two examples. One is a slow whistle song and one is much more rapid. What you're hearing is the voice of the forest encoded in the voice of the bird, if you like, and the voice of the prairie coming out in the voice of the sparrow. So the summer tanager first. So I hope you can hear that. The difference between the slow whistled song at first and then the very rapid one. If a larkspurrow was to sing in a forest, and I actually do this with my students, we go into a forest and play the song, and it gets absorbed and you can't tell, you can't hear all those trills and rapid whistles because the leaves have quite literally blurred the nature of the song. So wherever you are, in the world, even if you don't know the habitat the species lives, if you hear a really rapid trilling song like that, you can be pretty confident that that bird lives in open country, and the slow whistled ones live in particularly dense woodland. On the coast, you have another example, of course, and that is the waves crashing onto the rocks. And that's why creatures like oyster catchers and other coastal birds tend to have very loud and pretty high-pitched piercing cries, so that the low rumble of the waves is a low masking sound, and the birds are actually pitching their calls and their songs above that. So they're kind of vaulting over the mire of noise, and they're also just plain being loud so that they can be heard above that. So this, as I said, this is one particular example, but the same principle applies everywhere. And so as you're listening to frogs, as you're listening to birds and insects, think about how is this sound adapted to this particular environment? Why is this species especially loud or quiet? And a great example from Maine actually is in the summertime, the cicadas, and even better if you go out west to Colorado, the cicadas are very quiet compared to the cicadas in tropical areas. Why is that? they don't need to be really loud to outcompete all the other frogs and insects and birds, because the soundscape is relatively quiet in Maine or Colorado compared to the Amazon rainforest or the coastal forests of Georgia, where there are hundreds of species of insects all going at once. So you can even the amplitude of sounds can be interpreted. So local adaptation to place and to habitat is one reason why sounds are so diverse. I'm not going to talk about it here, but there are all sorts of sexual shenanigans that also increase the diversity of sounds. I devote a chapter or two of the book to that. Instead, now I want to jump to the other end of the spectrum, not local adaptation, but differences across entire continents. So listen to this contrast of sounds. And I'm going to play a recording that is first some bird song recorded in a woodland in Queensland, Australia, and then some recorded in a woodland in Tennessee. And don't try and pull out individual voices, but listen to the different character, the vibe, very different. I mean, you could be blindfolded and dropped, at random into these places, and you would know immediately whether you were in Australia or in the US, because the soundscape is so different, because the birds sound so different. So I hope you can hear the difference between those. I got more sound samples out on my website of these. Why does every continent have its own distinctive sound signature that comes from the birds and the insects and the frogs? What we're hearing is the legacy of movements of animals from one continent to another tens of millions of years ago. So the songbirds, for example, and the parrots evolved in Australia. And so Australia has a huge diversity of ancient lineages of songbirds and parrots and other closely related bird species. A few of those emigrated out of Australia, made it to Europe and Africa and North America. Say in North America, there was one wave that arrived here about 30 million years ago, another wave 18 million years ago that then diversified into things that we call North American flycatchers and warblers and things like that. So we are hearing, in a way, a subset of the Australian soundscape that has found its own form and its own set of hundreds of species of birds that have evolved on the North American and South American continents and found their own places in the soundscape here. So when you hear the voice of a tanager or a sparrow or flycatcher, you're hearing a local adaptation to place, but you're also hearing the legacies of plate tectonics and particularly of ancient movements of animals from one continent to the other. Interestingly, birds don't seem to make those continental jumps very often, whereas crickets, like field crickets, move from continents all the time because a few of them get on a branch, that branch gets washed across the ocean, they jump out on the beach and boom, they start breeding and they form an entire new lineage on another continent. So crickets actually sound very similar all around the world, partly because they are more closely related, because they've been jet setters compared to many other creatures. Okay, so where do people fit into all of this? And that's a complex question, and I'll give you one example of sort of my set of answers to that. And to give that answer, I'll look at instrumental music. So this is a bone flute discovery by Nick Conrad and his colleagues from caves in southern Germany, in what is now southern Germany. These flutes are 42,000 years old and are the oldest known musical instruments anywhere in the known universe. They're made from the bones of griffin vultures, so big bird wing bones that are already hollow. So all you have to do is carve out a few holes and you've got a ready-made flute or a clarinet if you put a reed on it. Swan wing bones the same way. So these are discovered from the same layers, from the same caves, from the same age deposits as the first three-dimensional figurative art known anywhere on the planet. Exquisite carvings of human figurines, but mostly of non-human animals, creatures that would have been part of the diet, but also creatures that people there, some of the first modern humans to arrive in what we now call Western Europe during the Ice Age, they were carving out, they were making art, both visual art, but also musical art. Another form of flute that was discovered in these caves is this one here. This is actually a replica of it made from mammoth ivory. So people would use their stone tools to carve out a small part of a tusk of a mammoth and to make two hollow, semi-hollow parts that are then glued together and tied with animal sinew and birch pitch, and then make a bunch of holes in that, and you've got a flute. And so this is a flute that was made by Wolf Hein as part of the research for my book. He worked with me on this, created, he was the one who created, I shouldn't say he worked with me, he was the artist who created this from samples of ivory. He works with museums and uses mammoth ivory to create these recreations for research purposes. And then Anna Friederike Potemkowski, who's a German flute player, played this flute to investigate how the flute might sound. And I'll play you a sample here. This is Anna Potemkowski playing the flute, this particular mammoth ivory flute. So a really beautiful, evocative sound. And note that this flute was made, it actually took multiple days for people to make these flutes. So they really wanted them. They used the highest form of their technology to create this, this musical art. And the flute also sounds good in the place in which it was made. So the flute was discovered in this huge reverberant cave. And flute music to this day sounds really good in caves. Because there's a lot of reverberance there. And that set up the first part of what I think is a very long co-evolutionary process between the form of musical instruments, the space in which they're played, and the kind of music that is played with them. So that creative triad continues to the present day. One example of this is when 19th century concert halls were built in Western Europe. All of the instruments on the stage were redesigned and rebuilt to give louder and more stable tones to fill those new spaces. So as space changes, as technologies change, so too does music. Now, when people listen to a lot of music with earbuds, that means that the human singing voice for that kind of music is no longer loud and operatic, just using the diaphragm filling an entire concert hall. Instead, we whisper into the microphone. And so a lot of contemporary music is very whispered because it's fitting the space which we have created for it, namely earbuds. In 10 years, we'll be listening to music some other way, and there will be other new forms of music to emerge to fit with that. All of this process dates back to these first ivory flutes all the way back in the Paleolithic. So I think humans belong within the community of life here. And to this day, when you listen to instrumental music, you're not just hearing human artistry. You're hearing the second voice of the forest. You're hearing a chimeric union between humans and other species. So our Paleolithic forebears, the hunters blew into the bones and the body of their prey, and from that emerged music. Now we use horsehair and spruce and pernambuco and animal skins and iron ore to create musical instruments. And so listening to music is in fact a deeply ecological experience. And I think one of the things we need to do in this age of ecological crisis is to remind ourselves of that. is that indeed human artistry and creativity is amazing and incredible, and music is about connecting with people around that, but it's also about connecting to the more than human world that needs our help now more than any other time. Back in the Paleolithic, humans had a relatively minor effect on the ecology around them. Today, of course, with 8 billion of us with big appetites, the pressures on the environment are much, much deeper. So let me skip through a couple of slides here and get to my concluding slide, and that is this one. This is a photograph of a courtyard behind an apartment in Paris. And you will see there is a European blackbird sitting up here on the edge of the chimney. And I'm going to play you that blackbird singing, and you'll hear that the singing has a kind of reverberant quality because it's echoing in the courtyard. So wonderfully evocative sound. And for me, it's particularly evocative because this is a sound that I grew up with when I was a little kid. We lived in an apartment and the only sound of spring was a Eurasian blackbird in the courtyard behind our apartment in Paris. And now when I hear it more than 50 years later, it carries me right back to being a child in those places. And of course, that's particular to me. Each of you have those sonic memories. They may be of other species, they may be of human voices or of music or mechanical things like air conditioning units and other things that we imprint on as kids as a sound of home. But the point here is humans have amazing oral memory. We are really good at remembering the sounds of other species and other people over decades, even when we're not trying to. I wasn't trying to remember this bird, but boom, I remembered it. It came to me unbidden as a memory when I heard it again much later as an adult. So amazing oral memory, probably because we're a linguistic species, much better oral memory than our close primate relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas. They got great memory for lots of things, but sound is not one of them. We're special. We're kind of like birds. They have good oral memory as well. And that creates this opportunity for connection with others. And so my invitation to you is to ask, what oral memories will you form in the coming weeks and months? And how will you invite other people, old and young, into the community of listening to the world, forming those memories, and then puzzling over where that diversity came from and how we can now protect it. And in this talk, I didn't sort of dwell on the threats to sonic diversity of forests being cut down and things being silenced, or the noise that is drowning out a lot of species. I think some of those stories will be familiar to many of you. The solution, of course, there are technological solutions and policy solutions. There also needs to be a cultural solution, which is that we start listening again, and in particular, listen with other people so that we draw the more than human world back into human memory, so that it can form part of our stories, part of our connections to place, that gives us a place to stand, gives us roots, sensory roots in the modern human world in this time of rapid change and crisis that we live within. So with that thought, I will end and would be delighted to take any questions, thoughts, comments that you have. So thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. Really wonderful. We do have some questions lined up here, but again, I mean, you're equally eloquent as a speaker and a writer, so we really appreciate you sharing that with us tonight.
Oh,
fantastic. I enjoyed the four-limb movements too. I noticed with some of the bird song and the other sound clips, I saw the four limbs movie. That was fun. It was great. Charles, do you want to kick off some questions here, or should I do that? Or?
Well, why don't you, can I just open this Q&A and see
Absolutely,
it?
please.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh. And there's been a little editorial comment over too, but I think this is a key one from Beth. How do you collect these sounds?
Yeah. Great question. I mean, my primary way of collecting sounds is just by listening and remembering them and writing them down and forgetting some of them and so on. So that's a primary practice. But I also have used various sound recording devices. I have some hydrophones. So these are underwater microphones that I put under the water to listen to creatures. And that's really mind-blowing to hear shrimp and crabs and fish singing to one another. I mean, we used to think the oceans were silent, but far from it. They're in fact very full of song. And using microphones on Zoom recorders. In fact, my favorite little one is a Zoom H1N that's, I think, costs about $100. Small, very portable recorder, and I like it because it's portable and it makes pretty good high quality recordings in stereo that I can just capture sounds as I go about my everyday life. I also have some fancier microphones and heavier recorders that I drag around and make, you know, when I'm really okay, I'm going out to the woods to make a sound recording, I'll take those recorders. I should also say this horrible device, the cell phone, I mean, it's destroying democracy and everything else, but it's got a good voice recording app on it and actually makes pretty good recordings. And so I have, like, I guess it was last summer, I was out walking and there was a mole cricket. So these are crickets that live entirely underground. They look like little moles and they call from underground chambers. And it was really loud. And so, I didn't have any recording equipment, but I had my phone and I made a pretty decent recording of it and as a WAV file, which is an uncompressed digital file. So just being prepared with that. I should mention that for those of you who are into birds, you probably already know this, but there's an app called Merlin, like Merlin the Wizard or Merlin the Bird, from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which will allow you to identify birds on the fly. And it's pretty accurate. I'm actually pretty impressed by it. Sometimes it comes up with identifications that are total nonsense, but mostly they're really good. And it's, if you don't know bird songs, it can act as your tutor to get you to the point where you don't need the app anymore. I mean, that's the goal with all this, you know, education and so on, is to get people to the point where you don't need the teacher. Now we can have a teacher. It's not as good as like a live human being, but in our pockets. So that's another form of technology that I think is helpful if we don't overdo it.
Fantastic.
Shall I go ahead?
Sure.
I just want to give David the reaction from Carl that your memory of the courtyard in Paris elicited a distinct memory that Carl has from of that call, Proustian memory. He distinctly remembers that call from his childhood on Long Island.
Yep. Yeah, the sparrow sounds.
Fine company.
Yeah, and you know that those memories I think are really important to share with others. So for example, I've studied birds and bird populations and taught ornithology classes and so on now for decades. But the most important piece of information I've ever received and heard about birds came from my grandfather, who told me about his childhood in the northwest of England and how the bird song that was present when he was a boy was almost completely gone by the 1970s, right? And so I was, of course, so he took his memory and passed it on to me. So now I have a way of not being vulnerable to the so-called shifting baseline of, through his story of understanding the decline of birds in agricultural areas in certain parts of England. But if he hadn't been paying attention, he wouldn't have any story to tell me. So that's our task now, is to pay attention. So we've got something to tell the future. So
in your discussion and mention earlier of the local adaptation, Willow brings a question that occurred to me. Do migratory animals she has change their song, type, volume, tone, dependent on their location? So in my mind, I was thinking we've got these incredible birds that travel thousands of miles from South America. We've got these Arctic owls who come this far south. Everyone is fascinated and stands forever at their glimpse of this for their life list. what do birds and other species do changing location?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, I'm searching through my mental database and not remembering any studies of migratory species on that, partly because I think a lot of migratory species, when they're not on their breeding ground, they're not making the same kind of song, their breeding song. However, birds and other species are vocalizing in lots of different kinds of habitats. And I think some of the best examples of that are from, say, white-crowned sparrows on the west coast of the US, where some of them live next to the roaring ocean. Others live in quiet areas inland. And these days, some of them live in the middle of the city where there's all kinds of urban noise. And there's great now multi-decade studies showing that the birds, whether it's anthropogenic noise or the noise of the ocean, the birds change their song so that it's not as masked by whatever is going on around them. And they're changing the frequency, but also what different parts of the song they emphasize. So lots of different sophisticated ways in which they modify it. Interestingly, during the COVID lockdown, the sound of San Francisco, of course, got a lot quieter, and the birds, according to a paper by Elizabeth Derryberry and her colleagues, reverted back to songs that they hadn't really been singing since the 1950s. I mean, these are birds that weren't around then. Those birds just live a few years. What they did was they were listening to the changed sonic context, and then they changed their vocalizations to fit it, specifically adding more low frequency elements. And that also increases the bandwidth of their song, which makes them more sexy. And so one of the problems with urban noise, for example, and ocean noise, is that if birds have got to lop off the lower part of their song, they're only singing in a relatively narrow band, which means they can't do as much like pyrotechnics with like going up and down in frequency, which is a way of showing off how physiologically impressive they are. Mm-hmm. So they have to compensate by coming up with other kind of ornamentations and things. So it's all kinds of ways in which adaptation, and honestly, there are a handful of species in which this has been studied. And so we're really in the early days of understanding the amazing ways in which sonic diversity is tuned to place and also to social context. Another example is from tropical species, where sometimes there are lots of cicadas and other things, and other times those sonic competitors aren't there, and species will shift their song depending on who else is singing.
That's great. You just answered another question, your reference to urban, the urban soundscape. There's a question here from Craig Kesselheim, who is asking how the ebb and flow of highway roar might influence that. So
the best evidence there is from airports, and actually there's evidence that birds will time their songs to sing in between the takeoffs and landings. And not during the noisy bits. Unfortunately, for urban traffic, it's often so ubiquitous that a lot of birds are just blocked out, that urban noise stops them from being able to be heard. And even birds that adapt to the city, like the Eurasian blackbird that I played an example, there's some great studies from Vienna that show that in the city, they sing louder and they sing at a higher pitch, that they still can't reach quite as far through all of that noise. And the birds themselves are more stressed out, even as nestlings. As nestlings, they show genetic signs of stress. The telomeres, the ends of the chromosomes, shorten, which is a sign of aging. Like my telomeres are a lot shorter than they were a few decades ago. In nestling birds exposed to urban noise, the telomeres start to shrink rapidly. So noise has effects of communication, but it also has huge effects on physiology, including human physiology. When we hear sounds, even if we're used to urban noise, our blood pressure goes up, and there are all sorts of physiological health consequences that in the US haven't really been studied particularly well. In the EU, they have estimated down to the last decimal figure exactly how many new cases of heart disease and death caused every year by urban noise, and it's in the tens of thousands.
Wow. Interesting.
I'm just looking at Susan. I think you need to give us a more complete question. I'm not understanding it enough to pass it on to David. Maybe Sean can read between the lines.
Oh, yeah, well, this is from Susan Hayward, with climate, I'll just read what she's written here. With climate
Okay, fine.
change comes a change in the frequencies.
Mhm.
And then she says par, but
Okay, fine.
Yeah, so the effect of climate change on soundscapes is complex. So one of the ways in which climate change affects sounds, for example, in the ocean, is by changing wind and wave patterns and the breakup of ice, which is a huge contributor to the background sounds of the oceans. Sound travels at different speeds, at different speeds in the ocean, depending on ocean temperature. And so there's also a temperature effect there. I don't think that's the biggest crisis facing the oceans, but there is a physical effect there. I think in terrestrial ecosystems, the main effect on climate change would be through changes in vegetation. For example, in the West, massive changes in fire regimes, so that forests that may be burned every 15 years are now burning every year or two and are down to mineral soil. And so that totally changes the composition of animal communities, mostly not for good in those realms. So yes, climate change intersects with sensory crises in all sorts of ways. Sometimes these are some multiplicative effects. Sometimes they intersect in ways that are more additive and are mostly about habitat change. Yeah. There's actually an interesting piece in the New York Times, maybe like just from last week, about people who are making sound recordings of ice breaking up and things like that, both artists and scientists, in relation to climate change.
interesting.
Carl is asking you to identify a really strange bird song.
Okay, well,
Maybe the strangest.
all bird songs are strange. I mean, the mute swan, right, is a champion. And the, for mine, it would be the vultures, because they actually don't really have a functioning syrinx, and yet they make these hissing sounds before they projectile vomit on you to defend their underground nests. So that's a particularly interesting bird song. On the other end of the scale, I think the winter wren, which of course you're familiar with, the beautiful, incredibly rapid vocalization, is a bird that sings all the way. I mean, taxonomists have split it into multiple species now, but essentially closely related species sing all the way around the ringing the northern hemisphere. So pretty much wherever the sun is rising, a winter wren is singing. And that's Don Kreutzmer, who is an amazing ornithologist and has written a number of books for a popular audience, as well as hundreds of scientific papers on bird song. I remember him talking about that in a talk that he gave, and that's an image that's really stayed with me, this ring of winter wren song going around and around following the sunrise. Winter wrens are interesting also in that, well, they're pretty loud, but they're very rapid. So they're one of the exceptions to the general rule that birds in dense forests don't sing very rapid, choppy, virtuosic songs. And it may be that the wren is intending its song just to be heard with clarity at close range and not at further range. That's total speculation. But I like birds that kind of upend the rules, particularly the rules that I just talked about. So yeah, that's another sort of particular favorite of mine. And in the South, we only get to hear them for maybe a week or two at the end of spring as they start to head on up north, because they winter here, but they don't breed here.
That's a cool story. You mentioned the importance, how important it is to start listening again, as a concept. You are a teacher. How do you get people to do that? How do you work that with your students?
Well, depending on the class, I'll take different approaches, but I teach a class on sounds and soundscapes, but I also teach environmental writing, things like that. So we go outside and we do listening exercises. Sit for 5 minutes and name every sound. And once you've named the sound, let go of it and listen for the next sound and the sound behind that, the sound behind that. Then another exercise where you let go the name and you just describe the sound. And then another one where you forget verbal descriptions, just feel in your body where the sound is coming from. Is it coming from a pinpoint? Is it a big dome of sound? Is it coming up from the ground? So the three-dimensional nature of sound. So I invite students into those short but focused listening exercises with particular prompts. In some classes, more zoologically focused ones, we do quizzes. So we're going to learn to identify 100 birds by ear, or in the soundscapes class, we do singing insects and frogs and birds and other things. And particularly in September, where I teach in Tennessee, there are so many crickets and katydids and cicadas and things like that. So we do a lot of actually learning to name and discern the different insect sounds. And some of them are really, really different. Once you start listening, you realize, oh, it's not just a uniform racket of insects. They're radically different from one another. And you get to know some of their personalities, and some only sing at dusk and others go all night and others are just at midday.
I know this isn't really a fair question, but to ask you to come up with a quick answer like this, but how do you then make that jump to thinking about implications for climate change or our impact or our place amongst all these things?
Well, for me, when I'm writing about things, which is how I think about things, it's always context dependent and place dependent. So one of the chapters in the book is about New York City and the soundscapes there. And there are wonderful sounds in New York and then some pretty distressing ones. And so the particularity of the sounds in Harlem and in Brooklyn and Manhattan, the stories, the complexity of the stories emerge out of the particularities of each place, which then suggests solutions. So as is true in many other environmental contexts, the solution for Brooklyn may not be the solution for rural parts of New England. It probably won't be, right? So we have to start first by listening. And there are big things like federal government legislation and so on that need to happen to deal with some of these crises. But in my own thinking, I think what's often missing from those big picture questions is a sense of the relevance of local and the sense of relevance of just human sensory experience. If the only way to save the world is by passing federal legislation, that's pretty depressing because we have very limited ability to affect federal policy, right? I mean, I'm now a voter in Georgia, and so I have a little more sway than I did in Tennessee, where my vote counted for nothing for 20 years. But even if you live in a swing state, it's like, well, you get to vote every few years and you can call your senators and all the rest. But how about rooting ourselves in a direct experience of our communities and finding out what things are beautiful and broken where we live, and then answering the question of what are we called to do? And I think I use that language of calling deliberately, because I think the answer for me is really different from my neighbor or from someone else and so on. That's the great thing about listening practices, is we're listening outward, but we're also trying to figure out who we are in relation to this world. And maybe it's working with kids, maybe it's just learning more for ourselves, or sharing things within a family, or doing some writing or artwork, right? All sorts of different solutions, or getting really involved in investment management decisions and things like that. So people have their own passions and skills and things that they're very good at. And that's the intersection that needs to happen, is lived experience of the problems of the world and its beauty, a celebration of that, and then who we all are as individuals, and figuring out where that intersection is and moving forward from that. And that's not easy. I don't have the answer for myself, let alone anyone else. But my hope is, through writing, is to share and elevate some of these stories that are often not told, like the stories of cicadas and frogs and birds. I think really matter because they're our cousins, they're our kin and neighbors. And I think if there is any ethical meaning in the universe, or any ethical rules, being good kin and being good neighbors has to be near the top of the list.
That can apply in so many arenas in our lives these days where we're having trouble. How are we doing on time, Sean?
Good. We have time for another question, I think.
Okay. There's a question and a comment. And this is from Michael, and it takes us back to the winter wren, David. The winter wren song is very long, give or take 10 seconds, and continuous.
Mhm.
Do you think that could possibly be related to its contravention of the normal paradigm for the songs of forest birds that you described earlier?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a great idea, because it's sort of in information theory, the idea is you want to get your signal through the noise. And if you repeat your signal and keep your signal going, you're more likely for the information content of that signal to make it through, rather than coming just one little segment of it. I mean, they're long, but they also are pretty repetitive. I mean, they keep on going. So yes, I do think that could be part of it. The other thing I would want to know with winter wrens is to do some actual sound transmission experiments in the habitats and the sound perches that they sing from. So, you know, the forests of that summer tanagers live in, you know, it's deciduous trees and they reflect sounds in a particular way. But winter wrens are often in places where there are lots of tiny little leaves, needles and things, which allow a lot more sound through them, partly because the reflection of sound is based on the wavelength of sound. And they choose particular song perches that may send their sound optimally through the environment. So the forest, as a human, I look at it as, well, it's just a uniform forest. I mean, I see a little bit more detail than that, but for a bird, a singing bird, they probably know all of the different amazing acoustic qualities of this log or this perch and use them to their advantage. That would be my hypothesis. And I think it'd be great. There is evidence of birds choosing song perches to their advantage. I'm not coming up with any examples. They could be out there of winter wrens. I need to look in the literature for that.
So I think you've gotten a couple of compliments here.
Well, thank you,
I was
everyone.
saving one for the wrap up, John. So we'll do that. I'll remind you had a comment about how beautifully you expressed. I think Carl's comment is about your inspired remarks about our responsibilities for each other, our friends and neighbors, our cousins, that we aren't doing a very good job of. That's my little editorializing.
Oh, thank you.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
So as the librarian in the room, I'm always interested in what motivates authors and what gets you started. Where do you think the germ of your excitement and curiosity in this part of the world came from?
Well, I think it comes from two places. One is the love of a particular kind of sound, and that is the written word. Because when we read, writing is very young invention, only about 5,000 years old. And when we read, we actually activate the auditory parts of our brain in part. I mean, there are other bits that activate too. So it's a weird thing that we humans can do this, even though we didn't evolve to read. We're taking a brain apparatus designed by evolution for one thing and using it in a different context. And so the love of the musicality and the stories in the written word is something that I have enjoyed all my life, ever since I learned to read, and I love being able to be part of that. So that's, for me, that's part of the answer, because it's like, why write anything instead of, teach some more classes or do this or that or compose something? There are lots of different responses to sharing stories with other people. And for me, the written word is a particular kind of magic that I really think is very resonant with me. And the sensory dimension of the world, whether it's sounds or aromas, or all of the details of how ants interact with wildflowers in the spring in the forest. For me, they're a bridge between embodied lived experience, which is so rich and wonderful, and the incredible backstories, particularly of evolution and ecology, that I think help make the experience, the immediate sensory experience so much deeper. So when I'm listening to a flycatcher singing and know that it's kind of been on this continent for tens of millions of years, and originally they came from Asia, and then before that from Australia, and that this particular species lives in this habitat and nowhere else, all of that information enriches my experience of the moment. And as a teacher, that's what I hope to do, is to enrich students' lives, and writing is kind of an extension of that, but also introduce people to those bigger stories that then all kind of triangulate to help us figure out how should we live in this world? Because I think that's the big question of the ethical question is a big one, but it's also the hardest one to answer. But how can we answer that question if we're not actually paying attention to the living Earth community? And my approach is just one. I mean, there are lots of other ways, and I regard myself as pretty amateur. I mean, there are other people who are much deeper into this work. We're all beginners because the diversity of life is so massive that you could spend 100 lifetimes and not understand one little patch of woods, let alone the whole world in itself. So kind of trying to grasp at that experience to get at interesting stories, and then to get at the ethical implications behind that.
I'm reminded by a library colleague of an upcoming program in this vein of sound work, that we're going to have a program on the 18th of April with Dianne Ballon, The Art of Sound, recordings from the coast of Maine.
Interesting.
Recordings she's made and mixed over the past fellowship year, introducing listeners to the beauty and the richness of sound. Maybe she was online with us tonight. We don't know.
That's
That
fantastic.
sounds like a magnificent program.
Yeah.
Dianne will share stories behind the sounds, including the difficulties of field recording, recording the navigational buoys, hang on a minute, from the water, and the discovery of a lost sound. And it's only online, and you can register at the library's website.
Right.
I got my promo in.
That sounds like a cool one, though.
Yeah, well,
To be missed.
couldn't be more germane to the conversation this evening.
Exactly.
And if we're right at the hour, if that was our goal, and I think these two comments toward the end, which weren't questions, really sum up everybody's reaction, David, to your time with us. How privileged we have all felt to be together and to be with you, and to have you lead us through this incredibly challenging and engaging and delightful conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's my honor to be with you all, and I wish you an excellent and sound-filled start of the spring season.
This is our season. And so others have said, thank you for this wealth of information. How fortunate we are to have listened and learned from you this evening. Hopeful that you will return to us again. Bravo. Best webinar of the year, hands down.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank
you very much.
Parting words.
Yes, just
Yes.
delightful. I can't wait to continue reading more and getting your other titles in my library and spending time with them. They're just incredibly elegant prose in an area and stimulating me in ways of thinking about the world that I need to be stimulated to think about it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. We all need that. We appreciate your very inspiring talk this evening.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Take care.
Well,
Okay. Bye-bye.
good night, all.